All I knew was I had learned that a Christian looked like this, and I wasn't that.
Rolling.
Here we are after some lovely internet technical difficulties. We're here on this episode of Backsliders with Linda Kay Klein.
Welcome. Thanks for coming.
I'm happy to be here.
We're so excited to have you on. I am a big fan of your book, Pure. It was a big healing tool for me as I was working through some of my hang-ups around sexuality and some of the shame that I feel like I was indoctrinated with in the evangelical community that I was involved in. So thank you for your work. Do you mind, for the listeners who don't happen to have the pleasure of knowing who you are, telling a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so I too was raised in an evangelical church for me in the Midwest, and I joined when I was in 7th grade. It was 1991, and unbeknownst to me, I was becoming a member of one of the first classes of adolescents to have grown up in this thing that we now know was the purity movement. But at the time, I just thought was the way that the world was. An overall ethos of you are either pure or impure. You are either worthy or unworthy, lovable or lucky, if any good Christian man will ever love you. Particularly, I'm talking to women and girls when I use that phrase. But this spoke to everyone, but there was an extra dose of embodied purity messaging for women and girls, where I really was taught that as a girl, I could lose my purity not just by having my own sexual thoughts and my own sexual feelings and making my own sexual choices, as boys could lose their purity, but I could also lose my purity by inspiring sexual thoughts and feelings in others, particularly in men and boys. So it really created this hyper awareness of my body, a hyper awareness of how I was being perceived by others. It was a very common experience for me, and maybe you remember similar things, Keylee. It was a very common experience for me to be walking around feeling like everything was fine, having fun with my youth group friends, maybe even praying and having, spiritual experiences, and then being pulled aside and told, you were flirting with the boys, or your skirt is too short, or whatever it is. And it always felt like it kind of caught me by surprise, right? Yeah. It felt like there was just no way to be who they wanted me to be, because there was always some new way in which I was going to be sexualized, even in ways that I wasn't aware of my own sexuality. Is that something that you experienced as well?
Absolutely. I can totally relate to that. And the thing that's most unfortunate is that I feel like it happened for me, and I feel like it happens for a lot of girls before you're aware, like you said, that you have a sexuality, that you could be viewed sexually. So it's almost like you are in a state of purity outside of the definition of like sexual purity. You're just a human being. If you're in church, you're connecting to God and your spirituality, and then all of a sudden something is placed on you, and there's a sense of fear and shame around it. And it can be so damaging because it impacts your relationship with yourself, your relationship with a higher power, and people around you. Yeah. And on top of the sexual, like the purity culture stuff, I was also sexually abused when I was younger. So I already had that fear and kind of panic around being viewed or touched in a way that I didn't know was something that people do. So then I went to church, to this mega church, to find a sense of safety and belonging. And unfortunately, after I became a member, the same messages started creeping back into my experience in the church.
Yeah.
So I totally relate to that. And what was so healing for me from your book was hearing so many stories of other women's experiences in the church. It made me feel like I wasn't alone. Yeah. And it's not something that I think more and more people are talking about it, but not a lot of voices, and finding your voice and the beautiful book that you put together of stories was so amazing and healing for me. And I just want to thank you. And if anyone's listening, I totally encourage you to read this book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you referenced the other stories, so maybe I'll just speak about that briefly. So essentially for me, like you, I really felt very alone for a long time. There was this idea that all of this was supposed to be easy if you were good, right? And all of the fear and the anxiety and the shame and the self-hatred that I was feeling was an incredibly isolating experience. And I ended up leaving evangelicalism when I was in my early 20s. And I thought that at that point, as I was changing my mind about whether sexuality and spirituality were mutually exclusive or not, and I was really, having an awakening that I felt like was going to free me of all of this shame and fear and anxiety. And what I found is that actually, in fact, those things were so deeply instilled in me growing up. The many, many times that I was taught to experience fear for my own protection, to experience anxiety for my own protection, from the, whether it was, other people's actions or other people's ideas about you, right, was still so deeply inside of me that now that I was in my 20s and starting to explore my sexuality and starting to challenge some of the things that I was taught about gender, actually those experiences of exploration started to trigger these almost PTSD-like reactions in my body. So the shame and the fear and the anxiety started to come out in nightmares, in anxiety that was so great that, in some cases, my eczema, which right before this, I went and grabbed some lotion. I still have eczema. But,
I thought it was just from washing your hands a lot.
Well, yes, all of this COVID-19 hand washing has definitely been playing a role in bringing the eczema out. But, the other thing that brings it out is a lot of stress and anxiety. So, so when I would explore, sexuality, even just talking about the possibility of having sex outside of marriage, I would be scratching until I bled, breaking down in tears, and taking pregnancy tests, though I wasn't having sex. All of these things that felt like these physicalized manifestations of this deep, deep secret fear.
Yeah.
And that, if I felt isolated before about the feelings, having them emerge in my body in these ways that were really scary, and that felt outside of my control, was much more isolating. And so it really was this incredibly to save my own life kind of choice that I made, which was to go back and start talking to some of my girlfriends who were raised in the evangelical church I grew up in and telling them what was happening to me. And it was, really just something that I shared based on a deep hunch that I couldn't possibly be the only one. Wow. And I heard so many stories from my girlfriends who, upon hearing my story, whispered back very similar stories from their own lives, even if they were still evangelical, even if they'd never kissed somebody until they got married, right? Mm-hmm. They were also experiencing many of the same things. That I ended up moving back to my hometown, and I did a year of interviews near my hometown with every girl I could get a hold of, now a woman who I could get a hold of, over a 10-year span from my youth group, and interviewing them about gender and sexuality and what did growing up in what we now know is the purity movement do to their development, and how was that manifesting in their adult life. And over the course of that, saw so many similarities and heard so many stories that reflected the secret truth of my own life that I began this 12-year journey interviewing people around the country, most of whom were raised as girls in white evangelical Christian churches, which is about 20% of the country. So it's a significant population, though the purity movement has been much more influential and has touched many, many, many more people's lives outside inside of that group. But the book really tells my own story and my own experience of breaking free, not from the church so much as breaking free from the shame. So the title of the book is Pure, and then the subtitle is Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. And, I bring that point around freedom up because I think a lot of people assume that that means how I broke free from the church, right? But the reality is that for me, leaving the church was just the beginning. It was the realization of the deep internalized, ways of looking at myself and looking at the world and fears of how others were looking at me, that actually was what I needed to be most freed from, right?
Wow.
And so that was a very, very long journey, and the book is the story of that journey and involves many, many other people's stories because, we heal together.
Yeah, that's so powerful. So many things that you just said about kind of your inspiration for writing this book and how you felt a whisper to talk with your peers about the experience. And the more you talked about it, the more you realized that you weren't alone. To me right now, that's so powerful because I feel like with this pandemic that's going on, there's a lot of fear and anxiety. But every time that people share, hey, I'm feeling afraid, like there's a lot of unknown, it's manifesting in my thoughts and my anxieties. The more we share that, the more we realize how connected we are and how we're not alone because we're all in this together. And I think it's just such a powerful example of the power of sharing your stories and how that proves that we're all deeply, deeply intertwined, and it takes one person to raise their voice and be brave enough to be vulnerable to spark a whole flood of healing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been incredible, just the flood that you referenced. It's been incredible to me. Listen, when I wrote the book, I worked on it for a very long time, for over a decade. And so I had enough data that I knew that this was huge, right? I knew that the claim of a generation of young women was not total hyperbole, right? But,
Right.
There's always this part of you, I think, when you're making a larger cultural claim, particularly for me, this was, when I was writing the book, we didn't really even have the word purity culture at the beginning of my writing the book, right? That's a very recent term. We didn't recognize that there had been a purity movement. So anyways, but there's always, I think a part of you when you're making such a cultural claim like that wonders in the back of your mind, how big is this really? Is this really, I just happen to be talking to the people who are impacted this way, but, we are not as representative of the whole as I suspect we might be. And since the book has come out, there really has been a flood, and if ever I doubted the scale and the impact of this movement, putting this book out there has assured me that it is absolutely impacting so many more people's lives than we are aware of. To this day, I'm still hearing from people on a daily basis, and the book came out a year and a half ago. So it really has been such an overwhelming realization of, man, are we not alone?
Yeah.
Right? Are we just so not alone? And the incredible thing is that over and over and over again, when I hear these people's stories, over and over, they say what you said, which was, I thought I was alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here we all were, right?
Yeah. There's this quote that we love. I can't ever remember. Actually, she's right there. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She has this quote that's called Stories Are Medicine.
Running with Wolves.
Yes. I love that book. I just finished it.
Yes.
Women Who Run with
gosh.
the Wolves.
Such a good book.
And we talk about that all the time with the films and series and even this podcast. Like, stories are medicinal. They can cause such healing just knowing that
somebody else thinks similar to us.
Yes. There's like such a powerful thing that shifts in a person when you realize, oh, it's not just me.
Yeah.
I'm not the only one who has this insecurity or this shame or this fear or this experience that, still hangs with me and I still have, that I'm still processing. And so that's kind of why we started this podcast and why we are making films now that are about some of the spiritual or religious hangups that have impacted even how comfortable we've been around each other as a married couple.
Totally. Yeah.
And the response has been so healing. It's always scary, as I'm sure you know. You talked about it in your book. Like, you went through a whole period of being like, what am I doing? This is very scary. You're stepping out into the unknown. You're sharing something so personal and vulnerable that, you know, a lot of people are afraid of hearing, acknowledging, talking about.
Yeah. You don't want them to worry about you, and they don't want to worry about you, but they might worry about you. And at the same time, you have to be okay with them worrying about you.
Yeah. But then as soon as you step out on that precipice and share your story, even if you only hear back from one person who's like, man, that was so powerful for me because I can relate, it's so worth it.
Yeah.
It's so powerful. What do I want to talk about next? I guess so we kind of talked about how you grew up. Where are you now, spiritually, or in what you believe, and how maybe that's different from how you were raised?
Yeah. Well, I spent a very long time not knowing what to call myself. It's funny, I was in a documentary theater piece, and we all had to say what our religious affiliation was as part of the documentary theater piece. It was on the culture wars. And I remember like I kept having to go back to the playwright over and over and be like, no, change it to cultural Christian. No, change it to ex-evangelical. No, like I just couldn't figure out, what I was.
Steeped in American Christianity.
Yeah. Right. So deeply steeped in Christianity that I don't know how to not have that word part of my title. And yet, not what I was raised with, that I also can't just say Christian and feel confident about that. Right. So
because they wouldn't have you with the beliefs that you have right now. Is that how you feel?
Oh, well, certainly the definition of Christianity that I grew up with, would not include the type of Christian that I am now, right?
Okay,
absolutely.
Okay.
And it's funny. I think when you start to deconstruct ideas, you deconstruct to different phases. And I think oftentimes when people are deconstructing Christianity, they're still, without even realizing it, accepting certain definitions of terms like what a Christian is. Mm-hmm. And so all I knew was I had learned that a Christian looked like this, and I wasn't that, right? I might still, love what Jesus had to say, right? And might still pray regularly, and might still consider myself deeply spiritual, but I'm not that, so I must not be a Christian. And so I spent many, many years really trying to figure out, what am I? This person who prays daily, this person who is really open to a broad variety of ways of touching the divine, the unknown, right? This person who is so deeply rooted in Christianity, who still says, "Dear Jesus," but if I'm not that, right? I'm not the person who grew up in a community that believes that if you aren't this, then you aren't one of us, right? I wasn't one of us anymore.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't until many years later that I started to work in religious reform, and I started to work with a lot of progressive Christians and progressive Muslims and progressive Jews and progressive Sikhs and, so on and so forth. And I started to see through people's modeling, people living out a very different idea of Christianity. And it was really spending time with people who were, seminary presidents or, faculty members at seminaries, who were wildly feminist, right? Who had dedicated their whole lives to Christianity to the point where it was their job, right? But who were radical in their approaches to life and unapologetic about it. Mm-hmm. And that was when I started to say, okay, maybe there is some part of me that can that can hold on to Christianity through a different definition. So these days I use the word Christian again, and I have had enough distance from it that I mean something different than I was raised to believe it could mean growing up. I increasingly understand that there are Christianities and that I have the right to choose which Christianity I am claiming, and whether or not somebody else hears it, the way that they hear it or the way that I hear it, that's their journey, and that's their sort of faith definition. But anyway, so that's where I'm at now. I don't go to church. I tried to go to church many, many, many times. It's really hard, I think, when you grew up evangelical, in a white evangelical church, to find another church that feels like home, that is going to be freeing in the ways that I desperately need it to be. I'll only go to churches that are LGBTQ affirming, for example. I really want churches to be very justice oriented, all of these things. But oftentimes, the churches that align with those qualifications don't have the throwing the hands up in the air and the telling your deepest, vulnerable truths to one another, which of course, growing up in the church, there were certain truths you told and certain truths you didn't. But the truths you told had this kind of air of honesty and vulnerability that I find myself really craving. So anyway, I don't not go to church out of a anti-church sort of a mentality, but just out of a feeling that it doesn't do for me what I need in my spiritual life right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
We talk about that a lot. We feel like this is church.
Yeah, we do.
Like we both are on our own journeys, and lately we're tossing around like the Christian story is the one that we were raised with, that we identify with the most. Like we can still culturally, we can still look at it and be like, these are really great truths. And at the same time, these are a lot of things that we felt were harmful or damaging to us or people we love. We felt like there were some things that focused on separation and labels and rules and condemnation, and that doesn't fit right or sit right with us and our relationship with the divine. But we're like, if other people are going to still claim the term Christian, should we? Just because like we feel like radically loving people and accepting them and loving them, period, no qualifications or conditions. We feel like that's very Christ-like, but at the same time, personally, I have still such a kind of what you were describing. Like, I feel like I have to put so many addendums on the word Christian to make me feel comfortable with it.
Asterisk.
But maybe in a few years, and I'm kind of already feeling that shift happening in me. It's like, no, we can define ourselves. And if I believe that a main takeaway from the Christ story is to love others as I hope to be loved, that's a good message. And in that sense, I am a Christian. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other day of what would I say if somebody said, or what would somebody assume of me if they asked me, like, if I'm a Christian? Like, are you a Christian? And my response would probably be, do I look like one? Do I act like one? And so it's like, what do you think? So is Christianity a test, or is Christianity a way of life? And so if it's a test, I'd probably fail your test. But if it's a way of life, then you probably won't be able to tell that I'm not.
Right. Well, I mean, the term Christian, I always learned growing up meant Christ-like.
Sure.
So, there are certainly many people I know who are claiming the title Christian who are not terribly Christ-like. And there are many people I know who are very Christ-like who would never claim the title Christian. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not overly attached to what labels anyone uses,
Right.
myself included, right? Or doesn't use, and feel like at the end of the day, I like this idea of like, if what you mean is, am I attempting to have my life model the radical acceptance and the radical justice that Jesus modeled? Yes, I attempt to be Christ-like in the sense that I attempt to live my life in that way. I like that. Like, look at my actions and tell me the extent to which they reflect the life of this person. And perhaps that is a measure.
Yeah.
Yeah. If the qualifier is, did you say this prayer? Do you still believe this prayer?
Do you go to church?
Do you check off these boxes each day? It's like, I don't know.
I know. Yeah.
But then again, like
I think I do wonder, like, from your point of view, like, what is Jesus to you, and would your belief in your faith and your spirituality exist outside of the context of Jesus, or could it exist outside of the context through that conduit? Does that make sense?
I think I do. I think it does. You tell me. I mean, gosh, listen, I feel like the spiritual is the great unknown for us as human beings.
Sure,
like,
yeah.
We can't possibly wrap our heads around any of it. And we can't possibly claim with any certainty that we know any of it without, I think, practicing hubris, right? Like dangerous pride.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you think that you have all the answers about the great unknowable unknown, that's hubris. and that,
I'm wary of you.
Yeah.
So whether somebody is navigating the questions and living the questions and in relationship with the unknown in one religion or another religion, or, in a way that they would sort of put outside the bounds of religion, to me, I don't see barriers between those things. Right. I think that we're all, living as humans, and those of us who sense that there is more than what we can touch and see and feel, we do our best to interact with and understand that. But sure, if I was raised in another culture, that was exploring that through other religious confines, I'm sure that I would claim a different label, right? But to me, it feels like this is why I probably spend so much time in interfaith circles. Like it feels like there is a larger conversation that is deeper and wider, that we're all having, and we're having it separately. And there's tremendous power when we can actually have it together.
Yeah, I think that's a main reason why I stepped away from organized religion, was because the certainty didn't sit well with me. These like
the hubris.
the hubris, the definitive, this is unquestionable. We're for sure certain we've got it right. All the other people have it totally wrong. And this is God, like in a box kind of.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
As if we could,
God in a box.
As if we could define something truly mysterious. But now through exploring a lot of reading other texts, doing like self-work through yoga and therapy, and kind of zooming out, I
psychedelics,
a little psychedelic microdosing. I feel like I've been able to step back. And at one point in my journey, I did feel kind of angry towards religion. I identified as an atheist because I was like, if this isn't it,
then it must be the opposite.
Yeah, kind of. That's just where I was. But now I definitely acknowledge that I have a spiritual life. I acknowledge that there is more going on than what I can see. There are deep connections that I feel with other human beings on this planet that to me feel like pure divine love. I feel divinity in creating. I feel divinity in conversation, in stories, but it's so much more tangible, and there's not a disconnect because I'm not trying to label it or define it. I'm becoming more and more comfortable with the mystery and the unknown. I'm opening up rather than closing, which is, what you do to protect yourself. I think that's why I turned to religion. I wanted a sense of security and certainty, but life is very chaotic. I think we're all feeling that right now. There's so many things we can't control. With the coronavirus is a crazy example of that.
Yeah,
it's an example of how wild life and nature is and how many things are unknown and uncontrollable, but also how connected we are.
Absolutely.
Literally.
In terrifying ways,
Yes.
and also in life-saving ways.
Yes.
Yeah, no, we have to do that communicating that allows us to be free from spiritual or religious bondage. We have to communicate with other countries, and within our own country, we have to work together to be able to overcome the threats that we're all encountering at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have to focus on, we have to acknowledge the darkness. We have to acknowledge this literal virus, which I think this is like a physical example of like what your work is, what our work is. It's acknowledging something that lingers, that if you do not heal it, it will grow and spread. I mean, I know that's kind of like poetic, but I don't know if you can relate to that.
I think we try to acknowledge fear as not the enemy, but an indicator of some truth as well. Like denial is not prevention. And fear has allowed generations of species to survive. So if fear was all bad, we probably wouldn't exist, because we wouldn't have learned anything when we saw somebody take poison and they died or they went through agony and pain. So it's a matter of like not making this binary good, bad, scary, like hope, not fear. Like hope is great, but what is that fear teaching us? What is that dark feeling teaching us? Is there some truth in that we can glean? I guess it's somewhat of like a yin yang type of philosophy. It's like even within the darkness, there is some light that we have to pull out. Like if we go through life only focusing on 50% of it, which is like the things that make us feel good, or the things that are only the bright side of life, then we're really missing out, and maybe we're becoming even overtaken by the other 50% without even knowing it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting to bring it back to the earlier conversation. It reminds me a little bit of, I was talking about how for many years I experienced the shame and the fear and the anxiety, but it didn't start to really become physicalized and manifested in my life until I started to actually move toward these things that were laced with shame for me: sexuality, my body, my confidence as a woman, different things like that. And that explosion of physical manifestations was not a new development in me, right? It was the revealing of something that was deeply present in my life. And that's something I do. I do coaching, and that's something that I talk with people about a lot. Like oftentimes when they come to me, it's because they've had some experience that has broken open all of these things being connected to one another, right? They may have had a flashback to something that happened to them when they were younger, and all of a sudden they're seeing, oh my gosh, it's touching everything. It's in my romantic relationships, it's in my family, it's in my church, it's all of these things are part of the same conversation. And it feels like everything is exploding for the first time, but in fact, it's not exploding for the first time. It has been there and present and part of your functioning in ways that you couldn't recognize and therefore couldn't deal with. And there's something, there is something really important about drawing forth the shadows, if you will. And I would say from the spiritual conversation, drawing forth the complexities. You were talking about, just focusing on the good things, quote unquote, right? But there's also, for many of us, the good things are the easy things. They're the answers, right? Mm-hmm. And the unknown, the place where we don't have answers, where we have to lurk around in the dark, where it feels scary. That's the reality of our human existence, and it is most certainly the reality of our spiritual existence. And to me, it feels like you can't actually do spiritual work unless you're in that space. That is what spiritual work is. It is swimming through the tremendous, messiness of it all, and trusting. There's a great amount of faith that comes in, whether it's religious faith or not, right? Yeah. Like trusting you will not drown, and trusting that you will be caught and that you will be able to catch one another. Yeah.
We've definitely, over the past, so we've been married almost 7 years, and I'd say really over the past 3 years, have we really been able to, through doing individual therapy, we've done some couples therapy, that we've been able to feel safe enough together to open up about some of the things that we're still working through and acknowledge how that's affected our relationship, but it's always been there. Yeah. We just weren't able to step back and realize what it was. And it was manifesting in lots of small ways. Yeah. And then also I feel like, so we walked through as a couple. Micah's dad passed away a few months ago, and he had cancer. And I think that through the two of us, and Micah more so, but it really taught us how to step back and examine suffering and see what we could take from it. Micah and his dad, their relationship was strengthened through that. And our relationship has been strengthened through us doing the hard work and talking about hard things and being extremely vulnerable and not being afraid to go to the dark in order to rebuild and be able to see the light out. So we believe that wholeheartedly, that you got to get dirty. Like you got to get in the mud and in order to heal.
Yeah. Ditto.
We're all on the same page here. So if I remember correctly, you spoke a little bit in your book about, I don't know if exactly what it was, if it was an illness you had when you were a teenager, and how just the things that you noticed that were a connection between your religious environment and how you handled being ill.
Yeah, there are so many things there. The connections between my religious environment and how I handled being ill. So the first thing is that when I started to lose blood and have a lot of pain, that I did not present to other people as someone who was in a tremendous amount of pain. did what I was supposed to do, and I put on a big smile, and I laughed extra loud in order to hide the pain, And I did go into doctors, but I talked to doctors in my usual bubbly way, the way that I was expected to perform happiness as proof of my joyful Christian identity, right? And at that point in my life, I'm talking about the pain and I'm talking about the blood loss, but I'm performing something else. And this disconnection was really confusing for other people. And a number of people in my life, including some of my doctors, just didn't believe me about what I was experiencing and felt that it would be impossible for me to be presenting the way that I was presenting if the things that I was saying were true. And the blood loss got worse and the pain got worse. And I, had a lot of conversations with God about how I needed to suffer better. I needed to be a better, more Christian sufferer, right? How can I be more holy and learn and grow through this experience? Are you giving me this experience in order to learn and grow? And it became almost this over spiritualized divorce from body. Right. So if I was divorced from body through, the purity teachings around sexuality, that certainly extended to the divorce from body around pain as well. Right. It was this larger sort of frame of how can your spirit and how can your mind control your body, and be greater than your body and circumvent your body. Eventually, after about a year and a half, it got so bad that I passed out on the floor of my dorm room, bathroom, the sort of shared bathroom. And someone came in and found me. I was like, I was in a very bad state. And we went to the emergency room. And I learned that I had Crohn's disease and that I had been ignoring, or others had been ignoring my Crohn's disease for such a long time that my intestines were so deeply ravaged that they were, I was losing my intestines, through my body. Oh. And so they rushed me into surgery, and I ended up having 4 major surgeries. And over the course of a year and a half, lost 40 pounds, had an ileostomy bag for a year, which isn't something I talk about a lot, but you can just imagine, my deconstruction about sexuality all happened while lying in a bed for a year with an ileostomy bag, right? So you can just imagine the kind of physical, questioning of everything. Mm-hmm. And in that year, the incredible thing that happened is I started going back to church a little bit here and there as I started to get better. Between my 3rd and my 4th surgery, I had a long break in which they wanted my intestines to heal before they reversed the ileostomy bag so that I could have a sort of makeshift large intestines again, made out of my small intestines, but they needed it to heal enough first before that 4th surgery. So I started to go back to church a little bit here and there. So now I'm going back to church and I am, tiny and weak and having to hold on to my parents to walk, and am getting compliments left and right. Everyone is telling me, what a good and beautiful girl I am. I was asked to play the Virgin Mary in the church nativity scene. I was asked to read things in front of the church, Bible verses in front of the church. And I just remember thinking, during this time, here I am, the girl who growing up worked so hard to be the good Christian. I worked so hard. I started every Bible study. I had started citywide Bible studies, that I ran out of my house for girls, obviously just girls. I started the Bible study at my own school. I, was constantly bringing people to church. I was constantly leading walking people through the prayer and, leading them to ask Jesus into their hearts. I was doing everything I could. And yet I was constantly being told I wasn't good enough, right? I was a stumbling block, a thing over which the men and the boys in my youth group would trip because of my flirtations or my short skirts or whatever it was that day that seemed to be wrong or bad about me. And for the first time, now I was suddenly acceptable. And it was a version of me that I did not want to claim, right? It was the version of me that couldn't run, and that couldn't play and that couldn't experience life.
Wow.
And that was the moment, I think, that I really, in that year, in that bed, I really started to question everything. It was coming back from that year that I left evangelicalism and started to explore sexuality for the first time, and that the shame and the fear and the anxiety started to come out in those PTSD-like ways. But that year, that center down year, right, was just a year of looking at each of the pieces that I had been raised with and really, really analyzing them and saying, how has this impacted me? Right? Well, this one almost killed me, right? This piece around body and denial of body and trying to be who they want me to be, almost killed me. So that one, for the sake of my survival, I will claim myself and face the consequences I felt at the time of losing my faith, of losing my church, of losing my family's approval, of losing my purpose in life, of losing the whole idea of who I thought I was in the world and what I thought the world was, but I would be alive.
Wow. Your story is so powerful because you went through such an intense experience, like literally a life or death experience. But I think everyone can take away something from that because, especially from our experience in Christianity, we found that if you grow up in a religion, there is a common theme that unfortunately there seems to be a pressure to perform, like you said, perform happiness, at least in a lot of circles of Christianity that we've been in. And that can be so damaging because life is not just happiness. And even in the Bible, which is interesting, like that's not like a happy book. There are terrible things going on. And yet, for some reason, I think it might be especially harder for women, but for people of all genders, there's like this expectation that if you are godly, then you will have a smile on your face and always be hopeful and always be, a people-pleasing representation of Christ. But that is unhealthy. And I think that your story is an extreme example of that, but I can relate to that feeling in my journey as well.
I'm very interested in this topic because I experience it on the regular with my mother. And I wonder from your experience and the other stories you've uncovered, have you come to know where that Christian inability to, or maybe not inability, but just like aversion to showing pain and showing fear is like a sign of godliness or a sign of hope, even a sign of hope. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's like a virtue to live in denial. And it's super confusing to me right now.
It's so interesting because we talk about church as the place that you go for connection and the place that you go for intimacy. And yet here, in certainly the church that I was raised in and that you were raised in, There is actually the teachings are teachings of disconnection. It's how do you disconnect from yourself? How do you disconnect from the parts of you that are deemed sinful? How do you disconnect from your body? How do you disconnect from your sadness? How do you disconnect from your anger, right?
Your desires.
How do you disconnect from your desires? Right, exactly. So how do you disconnect from self? And then, you may remember in the purity movement, it's not just about how do you disconnect from others physically, but it's also about how do you disconnect from others emotionally. So one of the hallmarks of the purity movement is that it took this abstinence only before marriage messaging and amped it up to such an extent that if you were even being emotionally intimate with somebody of the opposite sex, that was considered cheating on your future partner. So, this terminology around guard your heart. So people are literally being told to disconnect emotionally from others, in order to guard their heart, and to disconnect physically from others, and to disconnect from parts of themselves, disconnect from self. And what's really fascinating to me is that I think that the purity movement was under the impression that intimacy and sexuality, that these things were so inherently human that they would inevitably bounce back, right? That there was no such thing as actually tamping those things down, right? And what we're actually finding is that if you do tamp those things down, you can get to the point where you no longer are able to access them even, right? So certainly, physically, many of the people that I talk with are struggling with physical disabilities, pain around sexuality, and different struggles around sexual functioning, but a lot of emotional stuff, right? Yeah. A lot of ways that the emotional becomes a physical barrier, right? But also very much the emotional things, disconnecting from partner, disconnecting from self, feeling that they're floating above, right? These ways of disconnection have been so ingrained in us that they become a part of our basic functioning as human beings, particularly in intimate spaces, I think. And it's interesting because I think we thought that these things were not vulnerable, but in fact, they are deeply vulnerable. And of course, now we're at this moment in time as a society that I think that the purity movement inadvertently contributed to, where we are experiencing more disconnection than ever, where we are socially isolated. We have a huge increase in loneliness among people. We have huge increase in suicide. We have huge decreases in sexuality. So young people are having less sex than ever, but not just young people. People of every age are having less sex than ever. And not just in the United States, but globally, right? So we have so successfully shut down our ability to access self and to access others that now that's actually probably a bigger issue for us to deal with than like the hyper crazed sexual teenagers that I think that, we were that I say we, but that many were attempting to protect the world from, right? Actually, the threat, the greater threat is this disconnection. So, I mean, to go back to your question, Micah, though, around why do you disconnect? I think that the reason that people think that disconnecting is going to be healthy and good is because that it's going to simplify things. I think it goes back to what we were talking about before around, answers. And if we can keep everything in its box, it'll be tidy, right? So if we can just disconnect ourselves from this, or disconnect ourselves from emotionally, investing in somebody and then having them break our heart, or disconnect from whatever it is, then we'll be safe and we'll be contained. And there's no such thing as safety. We live in a world full of experience and full of people, and we ourselves are full of complexity. And so there's no such thing as safety. There's only imagined safety, where you are pushing these things down. But what's so interesting, going back to the conversations that I've been having since the book came out, mostly in my coaching sessions, what's so interesting to me is that I would say that of the women who I'm talking to, the majority of them have the same underlying theme. Lots of other issues, but like the underlying theme is around, what do I want? How do I even know what I want? How do I even know what I feel? How do I know when I'm sad or when I'm angry or when I want to do this or want to do that, you know? And then how do I actually express it? And how do I tell you, actually, I do care where we go to dinner, you know,
Yeah.
or whatever it is, right? How do I express it and how do I prioritize it?
Yeah.
I am interested in this topic as well because I feel like some part of Keylee and I's relationship has been me trying to convince her or empower her to be just as opinionated about situations as I am.
Oh yeah.
Because I don't want to control her. I don't want to make decisions for her.
Right.
I want a partner that has aversions to what I say.
Right.
So yeah, that's been something
My husband
that
would tell you all about the challenges of that.
What's crazy is that when we got married, we've never been particularly religious in our relationship, but we had a common background of both growing up or going through seasons where we went to church a lot, or that was a big part of our lifestyle. We definitely had a similar spiritual background and interest, but in our relationship, I didn't know that I was still, because I was outside of Christianity, I didn't belong to a church. Nobody was indoctrinating me anymore. How much of that was still going on in my subconscious. Like I thought that I wanted equal partnership in our marriage. I thought that I could use my voice, but I was still afraid to say certain things. I was still afraid to reveal things to Micah. I was still afraid to be wrong. Yeah. This podcast has been so huge for us because I feel like it's giving me almost more so than the films that we make, because there is another person with us, and it's like a live conversation where I'm having to become more and more brave about not filtering myself when that used to be such a huge part of my personality. And I think that I'm able now to recognize that a lot of that came from church and just the culture of the South, where women are supposed to be a certain way. And I was like, it was so heartbreaking when you said that when you went back to church after your surgeries and you were the weakest you had ever been and you couldn't run, that you felt like they were praising you. That really resonated with me because it was something I kept bumping up against when I was involved in church. I felt like I was being told to mute myself, mute aspects of myself. I've always had big dreams and wanted to create art and live in LA and pursue a career in entertainment. I've always wanted to make art. I've always wanted to use my voice, but I feel like I was encouraged in church to, okay, so sometimes God gives you certain desires, but what he really means is do this, and this is how you be a good Christian woman. So you may feel like you want to be an artist, but make sure you're an artist in church. That's how you
as a hobby. As a hobby, though, let's be real.
It goes back to the God in a box thing, in a security thing. I feel like American Christianity has a set of rules for each gender, and we've seen that play out in our relationship, and we're so far outside of the religion. We've had to work really hard on becoming comfortable being ourselves, and that's different for each of us. For me, it's learning to become assertive in a lot of ways, both in our relationship and in our life. But I think so many people can relate to that.
Yeah. I agree. And, earlier we were talking about, I said that when I was growing up in youth group, I experienced the fear and the anxiety and the shame, and that I felt like, at that point, those were survival mechanisms, right? Mm-hmm. That the fear is what kept me relatively, quote unquote, safe from the judgmentalism and the rejection, right? Mm-hmm. The shame is what kept me relatively, quote unquote, safe from, my whole community, collectively turning against me, right? So those things, I think, serve us at a certain point in our life when we're in certain contexts, and we learn that we'll be rewarded for those things. Mm-hmm. And I think that, here we are talking about intimacy, and I think that there's this notion that many of us who were raised in these contexts, particularly as girls, grew up learning that, like, the only way that you're going to have intimacy, the only way that you'll be loved, the only way that you'll be accepted, right, is if you do the kinds of things that fear and shame and anxiety make you do. Mm. Silence, shut it down, perform,
dissociate,
make sure that they're happy, dissociate, right? And so I think that's why so many people are struggling with that, because I think we actually have developmentally shaped people's perceptions of what will allow them to be rewarded with intimacy, what will allow them to be rewarded with acceptance. And, now many of us live in different cultures, and have different relationships and different marriages, and have to learn a different way of being to receive the intimacy. Because I think, one of the things that's interesting is, like, I think so many of the women I'm talking to, and they might subconsciously be operating this way, it's not necessarily conscious, but they feel like if I just say, oh, I don't care where we go to dinner, then he'll choose the dinner place and he'll be happy and they'll have a great time, and therefore she'll get to be close to him, right? Oh. Whereas if she says, like, actually, I hate sushi and I always have, and there's a reason that I always have to order this, this other thing on the menu. Like, I don't want to do sushi. It's going to create conflict, and he won't be happy, and we might not have intimacy. And the reality is, though, is when we're not bringing our whole selves, that's what's actually, keeping us from true intimacy. Not only intimacy with ourselves and our own desires and our own feelings and wants and needs, but also intimacy with others. Because, I think that we can tell deep down when the person with us is 100% present. And when they are keeping some part of themselves separate. So it's interesting, a lot of this is just about unlearning and relearning, but that takes really deep work. It takes really deep work to say, all of these ways of being in the world that I learned, need to be looked at one at a time in order for me to then repave my neural pathways to accept a different kind of reward, and to, go through the risk before you receive that reward. Like we were talking about before, there is that period where it all becomes revealed, and everything goes like, blah, 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 and you're like, everything's falling apart, right? Well, no, everything has been there the whole time, but you have to have that. It has to be revealed. So maybe there will be an argument about the sushi thing. Maybe that will happen. And maybe for a moment there won't be intimacy and closeness, but that is part of the process of bringing our whole selves to each other.
Right. Like, conflict is okay. Not agreeing is okay. Expressing your opinion is okay. Being wrong is okay. It's a part of life. It's a part of relationships. So, and I think it does take a lot of time, like you said, to repave those neural pathways, because it's not like we were given the messages that we received in childhood once. Right. We were sponges. It was deeply embedded in us in a lot of different ways. Relationally, through church, through culture, through media, whatever. So it takes a long time to rework those and set yourself on a path where you are learning to be comfortable in the discomfort.
Yeah.
And to not give that so much negative power. Like, so much growth can come from being way out of your comfort zone.
I like what you just said. And I again want to tie it back, because I think you're right. I think there's something about the not asserting, or even maybe even being aware of your wants and needs, that is about this idea that, like, I'll be easyggoing, I'll be cool, I'm the go with the flow,
I'm
person.
likable.
I'm super likable and super cool, right? That has to do with this notion of separation, right? Like, if I expose everything that is not simple, then I have to deal with the mess of life. And it would just be so much simpler if we could all just be simple, starting with me. How can I just be simple and not cause problems, and not, create conflict, and not upset my church, and not upset, the world, right?
Yeah, that played out, and we see that play out in both of our families. Like, in my family, it's a lot of, let's not talk about certain things because people will be upset. It's just easier if we're like, we're good. We're a family that presents well. We present like we like each other. And yes, it's a whole different story when we're behind closed doors, but don't talk about it.
I mean, it's the reason why we started making this podcast. It was just like, these are the topics you're supposed to avoid.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to talk about religion. And so we are.
Yeah, because we're curious about that. We're like, well, it doesn't seem to be working. People avoiding uncomfortable topics, people saying certain things are off limits, they're taboo. Do not talk about sexuality, do not talk about religion, do not talk about politics. Well, here we are today, and it seems like a valuable tool that we all should be cultivating is how to talk to one another, especially about things that are so meaningful and are essential aspects of all of our lives. Because when you don't acknowledge something, it just grows and grows and can cause a lot of damage. But when you honor it and you approach it with curiosity, then healing and connection can come in and do a whole lot of good.
Yeah. I do, before we wrap up, I do want to know, on the topic of like deconstruction and reconstruction and resetting those pathways, what are you referencing now? Is it based on your personal experience of like, now you have like a visceral understanding of what wasn't working and now it's exposed what does work? Or are there other resources that you would refer people to in regards to like, hey, you've now started your journey of deconstruction. Now what? How do I reconstruct healthfully?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. So part of it, just is my experience and the experience of the many, many people that I've been talking with. But, we know scientifically that this is how this works too. Take the idea of a habit, right? You've probably heard people say, if you do something for, I can't remember, there's some magic number that research shows, like 40 days, right? If you do something for 40 days, you can start a habit, right? This is how we actually do retrain ourselves, right? We actually have to live it long enough that our brain starts to connect in new ways and say, oh, like my dog gets a treat every time he takes a bath, right? And those things are completely merged for him at this point, right? So some of it really is this active retraining process, but I don't think it goes deconstruction, reconstruction. I actually think it goes, and I talk about this in the book, it goes deconstruction, the gap, reconstruction. And the gap is this utterly terrifying time where you have no compass, because you have just learned that your old compass is utterly broken. And how do you build a new compass from those broken parts when you don't know which of them are fundamentally flawed, and toxic, and which of them, might actually have some kernel of useful truth to them, and which things you need to pull from elsewhere. And so there's this period where you're in the gap. And the gap, I think, is really a time where you have to have your greatest level of bravery and trust and leaning into connection with other people. And that's the period where you don't know what's up, you don't know what's down. You might be whipped over to a new way of looking at the world and then whipped back to your old way of looking at the world. You might be kind of like floating and unable to like find anything that feels solid, right? And in that period, what I think is really important is finding other people who are either in the gap or who have found their way to solid footing to the reconstruction process on the other side. So I think before we even get to reconstruction, we have to get to each other. And that's why I think it's so powerful what you all are doing. And I really healed and found my healing through the process of reading the sacred text of one another's lives, right? Mm-hmm. And that was the first step. And hearing in other people's journeys the similarities to my own and the differences, and where they had found some life-giving ingredient that I could incorporate in. So I have a nonprofit, and it's called Break Free Together. And the whole thing is based around story exchange. And the reason that we base it around story exchange is because so many of us are in the gap. We're starting to reconstruct, but we are, and we're still probably doing some deconstruction, but we're really in this period of time where we really need each other to be able to get to that second solid ground. So we have different story exchanges where you can host one in your home, host a purity culture story exchange with your friends around a dinner table. We have, I'm thinking about doing some group calls where people can meet on a monthly basis on the phone with one another, on Zoom with one another, so that people can meet each other in different places. We have a postcard campaign that just finished up where people sent their stories and postcards. But I'm trying to find these different ways to help us find each other when we're in the gap, this terrifying, compassless, groundless, period of time.
Yeah.
But I think once we start to have a sense of what solid ground might look like, that's when we have to start to do the hard work of repaving, and the repaving is around, for example, saying, I hate sushi. and seeing that the relationship doesn't fall apart or whatever it is, right? And the more that I think we do these things, and one of the things that I also do with people a lot is we'll look at the old stories that people have learned growing up that haunt them, right? And we will reconstruct those stories. So I'll give you an example, and that's part of repaving too. We've all internalized all these ways of looking at the world, all these stories, all these metaphors that need to be dismantled and that need to be replaced. So I'll give you one example maybe as a closing thought. So did you all ever read I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris?
Yeah.
We just watched that documentary about it last night, and I don't know if I read the full thing, but I had it.
I definitely read it in high school and probably again in college.
Oh, well, yeah, sometimes you got to go back.
I probably didn't adhere to it for more than a month.
Yeah.
But
that's why you had to read it again. No,
I definitely carried the shame around.
Yeah. So for people who aren't familiar with I Kissed Dating Goodbye, the idea is that even dating is too much intimacy. And that we shouldn't even date other people because that would be not guarding our hearts and not guarding our bodies. And so we should instead engage in courtship. And you do that with the full involvement of your family and your intended's family, and court for marriage. But anything other than that, even dating is too intimate, right? Mm-hmm. Interesting. So anyway, the opening scene of that book is something that has been something that a lot of people carry around, and maybe you'll resonate with this, Micah. It's this scene where And I have to remember exactly. Do you remember it? Do you want to tell?
I think it was in
because
the
we watched the documentary.
The wedding?
Yeah, so it's like he gets up to get married.
Yeah,
he gets up to get married, and then his wife is there across from him, and then like all these girls from the audience or the church come up and stand behind him, and she's like, "Who are these women?" And he's like, "They're all the girls I gave pieces of my heart to. I'm so sorry."
Right. So he's got him and his wife, and then next to him, that girl and that girl and that girl and that girl and that girl. Right. So that would be a story, for example, that a lot of people I've talked to have carried around with them. Right.
Yeah.
Now that I'm married or whatever the case may be, I've still got, all of these people, or my wife still has all of her people, or whatever the case may be. Right.
Yeah.
So one way that I have worked with some people to deconstruct that story, and we kind of need to do this with all our stories, right? All our deeply damaging stories we need to dismantle. So one thing that I've done with people on that story, as an example, is walk them through a meditation where you are having that story happen. You have those women stand up next to the man, or those men stand up next to the women, or both. And then I said, and now I want you to imagine the people in the congregation that you're obviously church wedding, right? In this scenario, right? Who have shamed you or who have judged you. I want you to see them stand as well. And I want you to imagine thick ropes tying you to each of those people around your wrist, right? And around their wrist, tying you to each of these people, right? And then I want you to imagine pulling out a sword and cutting through these ropes and untying all these ropes from your wrist and asking those people to please leave this church, right? Please leave this space that is designed for me and this other person to claim our love to one another in this moment, right? Yeah. And watching them walk out there and being able to. So some of the work I think really is around taking some of these old stories that haunt us and trying to do the work to strip them of their power. Right.
Yeah.
And then some of the work is around creating new stories, right? Like the story of, I said I like sushi. I said I don't like sushi, and we didn't fall apart. The story of another metaphor that is actually quite meaningful, right? That you can spend more time with, to really take that metaphor in and engage with it as much as you might have engaged with the I kissed dating goodbye metaphors or whatever it is. So that's what I mean. It really does take time and take work to do the reconstruction process. But you can't do it too quick, right? You need to honor the gap, and you need to honor the unknown, and honor the messiness that we've been talking about, this whole conversation. And the only way that we can survive it is by grasping for one another while we're getting, whipped around in that space.
Yeah.
It's a lifetime.
Yeah. That example was so beautiful. It made me tear up, because a version of that story was something that stayed with me for a long time and was damaging to our relationship, because I was still tied to all these lies about shame and unworthiness being attached to sexuality, my sexuality and his sexuality. And that image of realizing that you have a sword and you can sever those ties is so powerful. It actually reminds me of, speaking of interfaith, of a tarot card reading that I had done by a friend. There was a card where there's this woman and she's all tied up with rope, and she has a sword in her hand. And the message of that card is she's attached to so many things. It can be representative of shame or problems, challenges in your life, but you hold the key to your healing. And sometimes it takes you a while to realize that option is there, that what agency we all have as individuals to own our own healing. And like you said, that's what we aim to do in our work, is we're taking stories, especially in Backsliders, the new series. We're taking stories that were harmful to us and we are shifting them. I'm so excited to share the one about sexuality with you because I think you're really going to get it.
Yeah.
And reconstructing those stories does take time, and it is so healing. And I just want to thank you for all of the work and the community that you're building that's enabling so many people to begin to do that. Everyone who's listening or watching, I highly recommend Linda's book, Pure.
There it is.
You can find it, I think. Where can you find it? Look at this beauty.
Wherever you like to buy books. Very nice for you to support your local bookstores in this moment, particularly when it's hard to get to the bookstores. So if you can't do it in this moment, we understand, but, know that they will be struggling and will be eager to order the book if they don't have it. But you can buy it, online anywhere.
Okay. And if people would like to follow you on social media, do you want to tell us how to find you?
Sure. I've been spending more time with Twitter. I didn't join it, or not with Twitter. I just said Twitter, but I didn't mean it. I've been spending less time with Twitter and more time with Instagram. I just joined about a year ago, but I really like that space. And I've really been able to use that, I think, more as a community space. Yeah. So I have 2 accounts there. One is my name, Linda Kay Klein, and that's Kay, my middle name spelled out. So Linda Kay Klein. And then the other one is Break Free Together. And Break Free Together is currently the postcards that people have sent with their stories about what they learned about sexuality growing up and the legacies that those teachings have left on their adult lives. Though we're going to be using that account for more nonprofit story sharing later. But both of those accounts, I think, are really great places to find community.
Yeah, those are so great. We follow you and we really enjoy the way that you still continue to share other people's stories. Thank you so much for being our guest. And thank you to everyone who's listening. We feel like right now is the most important time to be having meaningful conversations and connecting with others, even though we're all stuck at home. Through the internet, there is so many opportunities to reach out with other people. So call someone you love or share this podcast with them. And if you don't mind showing us a little support, please rate, review, and subscribe. That really helps us show up so that other people who are looking for this content can find it.
Keep connecting.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I'm not saying that it wasn't real. I'm just saying that you made me feel bad. Don't try making me a better deal. I'm done with you and I'm fine with that, and that's that.